The crowd turned as an older gentleman stepped forward from the side of the stage. And there he was. The same frail man from the street, standing proud beside his son, his eyes never leaving the officer's face. The officer's throat went dry. His world was tilting, and he had nowhere to hide. The officer stood frozen, his breath shallow as the weight of the moment pressed down on him. Around him, his fellow officers continued clapping, some murmuring in admiration at the presence of the new chief's father. But for him, everything had gone silent. The old man didn't speak. He didn't need to. His gaze alone carried a message, one the officer couldn't ignore. It wasn't anger, wasn't even disappointment. It was something worse. It was knowing. As if the old man could see straight through him, past the uniform, past the badge, right into the kind of man he really was. A bead of sweat formed at the officer's temple. He forced himself to look away, but his thoughts were spinning. Did Chief Carter know? Had his father told him? Was this all just coincidence, or was this the beginning of something bigger? Chief Carter continued his speech, speaking about leadership, accountability, and the department's role in serving the people. Every word made the officer's chest tighten. Then, as the applause died down and the chief stepped away from the podium, officers began mingling, shaking hands, offering congratulations. The officer thought about slipping out, disappearing before the chief got too close. But just as he turned toward the exit, a voice stopped him. "You seem in a hurry." His spine stiffened. Slowly he turned. Chief Carter stood before him, calm, unreadable. Up close, his presence was even more commanding. His father stood just a few steps behind him, still watching. The officer forced a tight smile. "Just had somewhere to be, sir." Chief Carter didn't move. "What's your name?" His mouth felt dry. "Officer Daniels." The chief nodded, as if filing the name away. "How long have you been with the force, Daniels?" 3 years, sir." 3 years. Chief Carter repeated the words slowly, like he was weighing them. "I imagine in that time, you've had a lot of interactions with the community." Daniel swallowed hard. His mind screamed at him to stay calm, to keep his face neutral. "Yes, sir." The chief studied him for a moment, then glanced at his father. "You know, my father has always believed you can tell a lot about a man by the way he treats people he thinks don't matter." His eyes returned to Daniel's. "What do you think about that?" Daniels felt his stomach drop. He couldn't tell if it was a test, a warning, or something worse. Daniels felt the air grow heavy between them. Every instinct told him to get out of this conversation, to say something safe and move on, but his mind was blank. He forced a chuckle, hoping it would mask the unease crawling up his spine. "I guess that sounds about right, sir," he said, his voice steadier than he expected. Chief Carter didn't break eye contact. "It does, doesn't it?" The words hung between them, carrying an unspoken weight. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. Did he know? Was this a trap? His mind replayed the moment from earlier. His own voice sharp, his stance aggressive, the way he had looked at that old man like he was nothing. And then the spit. His chest tightened. If the chief knew, this wasn't just about a bad interaction. This could cost him everything. His job, his future, his reputation. The old man still hadn't spoken. He just stood there, quiet, patient. And that silence was worse than any outburst could have been. A voice interrupted the moment. "Chief Carter, a quick word." One of the senior officers approached, pulling the chief's attention away. Daniels exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. But just as he thought he might be in the clear, Chief Carter turned back to him. "Stick around, Officer Daniels. I'd like to have a conversation before you go." Daniel's throat went dry. "Of course, sir." As the chief stepped away, Daniels clenched his fists, his mind racing. He needed to think. Fast. He glanced toward the exit, calculating. Could he just leave? Pretend he hadn't heard? No, that would only make things worse. Instead, he turned his attention back to the old man. Their eyes met again, and this time, Daniel saw something he hadn't noticed before. It wasn't just quiet judgment. It was understanding. It was something deeper, something that made his stomach twist in a way he didn't expect. Late one evening, on a quiet city street, a frail old man shuffled his way toward the corner store. His steps were slow, his back slightly bent with age, but his eyes still held the wisdom of years past. As he moved along the sidewalk, a police cruiser pulled up beside him. The officer inside, a young white man with a hardened expression, eyed the elderly man with suspicion. "Hey, where do you think you're going?" the officer barked, stepping out of his car. The old man paused, his hands trembling slightly as he turned to face the officer. There was no crime, no wrongdoing, just a man going about his evening. But that didn't seem to matter. Without waiting for a response, the officer took a step closer, his posture tense, his presence intimidating. "I've seen you around here before," he said, his voice laced with something colder than authority. "People like you always seem to be looking for trouble." The old man met his gaze, calm and unwavering. "I'm just heading to the store," he said, his voice low but steady. The officer let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head as if he'd heard a joke. Then, in an act of pure disrespect, he leaned in and spat at the old man's feet. The gesture was full of contempt, a display of power meant to humiliate. The old man froze, his face unreadable, but something shifted in his eyes. A silent storm brewed behind them. For a moment, the street was silent. A slow breath passed through the old man's lips as he straightened his posture ever so slightly. "You don't know who I am, do you?" he asked, his voice eerily calm. The officer smirked. "Doesn't matter." But it did matter. More than the officer could ever imagine. Because in just a few hours, when the department gathered to welcome their new police chief, that same officer would stand in the crowd, his chest puffed with confidence, until the moment his new boss took the stage. And there, in front of the entire force, the officer's world would come crashing down. Because the man standing at the podium, the new chief of police, was the son of the very man he had just disrespected. The officer stood tall among his fellow officers, arms crossed, wearing a look of indifference as the crowd gathered inside the precinct's main hall. The air buzzed with conversation, but he wasn't paying attention. He was still thinking about the old man from earlier, the way he had stood there, completely unfazed. Something about him had been different, too calm, too knowing. It didn't sit right with him. Then the chatter in the room died down. A senior officer stepped up to the podium and cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great honor to introduce our new chief of police," he announced, pausing for effect. "A leader who has dedicated his life to justice and fairness. Please welcome Chief Anthony Carter." The room erupted in applause as a tall, well-dressed black man stepped onto the stage. His presence commanded respect, his expression firm yet unreadable. The officer in the crowd clapped along half-heartedly, not particularly interested, until the chief spoke. "Thank you," Chief Carter began, his voice strong but calm. "I stand here today not just as a leader, but as a man who believes in the power of this community and the responsibility we all share." His eyes scanned the room, landing briefly on the young officer. The moment their gazes met, something shifted. The officer felt his stomach drop. That face, it was familiar. His mind raced, trying to place where he had seen him before. And then, like a punch to the gut, it hit him. The old man. the one he had insulted, the one he had spat at. His heart pounded as realization sank in. This wasn't just some old man. This was someone important, someone connected. Chief Carter continued speaking, unaware of, or perhaps fully aware of, the panic now creeping into the officer's expression. My father taught me the meaning of integrity, of standing tall even when the world pushes you down. He showed me what it means to treat people with dignity, no matter who they are. He paused, his eyes locking onto the officer again. And he is here with me today. For the first time, Daniels wondered what kind of life this man had lived, what he had seen, what he had endured, and why, despite everything, he still stood here with his head high, looking at the same man who had tried to humiliate him. Daniels looked away, but the feeling didn't leave him. If Chief Carter knew what had happened, if this was leading where he thought it was, then Daniels wasn't just about to have a conversation. He was about to face something he wasn't ready for. Daniels felt trapped, his body tense as he stood near the edge of the room. Officers moved around him, shaking hands, exchanging words of praise for their new leader. But it all felt distant, like white noise behind the storm brewing in his mind. He needed to get ahead of this. He needed a plan. His eyes flicked back to Chief Carter, who was deep in conversation with senior staff. The old man stood a few feet away, calm as ever. He wasn't smiling, but there was no anger in his face either. That made it worse. If the man had been furious, Daniels could have prepared for an argument, maybe even tried to defend himself. But this silence, it felt like judgment waiting to be delivered. Then as Daniels fought to steady his breath, he felt a firm hand grip his shoulder. His heart nearly stopped. "Step outside with me." It wasn't the chief. It was another officer, Sergeant Holloway, a veteran on the force, respected, well-connected. Someone Daniels had always seen as an ally. Daniels nodded stiffly and followed Holloway out of the crowded hall and into a quieter corridor. The older officer glanced around to make sure no one was listening before turning to him. "You screwed up," Holloway said flatly. Daniel's throat tightened. "I don't." "Cut the act." Holloway's voice was low but sharp. "I don't know what you were thinking, but you picked the wrong man to mess with." Daniel swallowed hard. So he did know. Did the chief say something? "Not yet," Holloway said, crossing his arms. "But he will. And when he does, you're going to be in a world of trouble." He exhaled sharply. "The question is, how bad do you want to fix this before it gets out of control?" Daniels felt his stomach turn. "What do you mean?" Holloway leaned in. "Carter's new. He's got something to prove. He's not gonna ignore this. But I know people. If you want this to go away, we have options." Daniels blinked. Options? Holloway's expression didn't change. A favor. A conversation in the right place. Things don't always have to be official. But you need to decide fast. Daniels felt his pulse pounding. This wasn't just about the old man anymore. There were deeper forces at play, and now he wasn't sure which mistake would cost him more, the one he had already made or the one he was about to. Daniel's mind raced as he stared at Holloway. His options were laid out before him, but none of them felt safe. If he took the surgeon's offer, whatever that truly meant, he might walk away clean. But if he refused, he risked facing Chief Carter head-on, and there was no telling what would happen then. For a moment, he thought about lying, about making up some excuse, blaming the old man for being uncooperative, twisting the story just enough to protect himself. But then his eyes drifted back toward the main hall, where Chief Carter stood, shaking hands and exchanging words with other officers. His father stood close by, his posture strong but quiet. Daniels took a breath. "I can handle it," he muttered. Holloway narrowed his eyes. "Are you sure about that?" Daniels nodded, though his pulse pounded. "Yeah, I'll deal with it." Holloway studied him for a long moment, then let out a short breath. "Your call," he said, his tone unreadable. He patted Daniels on the shoulder before walking away, leaving him alone with the weight of his choice. Taking another breath, Daniels squared his shoulders and stepped back into the hall. He didn't have a plan, just the sinking feeling that this moment would change everything. He didn't have to wait long. Chief Carter spotted him and gestured him over. Daniels hesitated, then forced himself to move, his legs heavy. When he reached the chief, he felt all eyes on him. Carter didn't waste time. "Walk with me." Daniels followed him into a quieter area of the room. The old man was already there, standing near a window. Daniels felt his stomach twist again. Carter turned to face him, his expression unreadable. "My father told me what happened today." Daniels' mouth went dry. This was it. "I could take this through official channels," Carter continued, his voice measured. "I could have you written up, suspended, maybe worse." Daniels nodded stiffly, forcing himself to meet Carter's gaze. "I understand." Carter studied him for a moment. "Tell me something, Daniels. Why did you do it?" The question caught him off guard. He expected punishment, a lecture, something. But not this. Daniels hesitated, then exhaled sharply. "I don't know." He shook his head. "I wasn't thinking. I let my own biases get in the way." The words tasted bitter, but they were the truth. Carter's expression didn't change. "And what do you think happens now?" Daniels felt a lump in his throat. "That's up to you, sir." For a long moment, there was silence. Then the old man finally spoke. "People can change," he said, his voice softer than Daniels expected. "But only if they want to." Daniels glanced at him, searching his face for anger, resentment, anything. But all he saw was patience. Carter sighed, looking back at his father before turning to Daniels. "I'm not letting this slide," he said. "There will be consequences. But the question is, are you willing to do the work to be better?" Daniels hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, sir." Carter held his gaze a moment longer, then gave a single nod. "Then we'll see." Daniels exhaled, feeling the weight settle on him. He wasn't sure what was coming next, but one thing was clear. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something else entirely. Daniel stood there for a long moment, absorbing Chief Carter's words. The weight of the conversation pressed down on him, heavier than any punishment could have been. He had expected anger, expected to be thrown under the bus, but instead, he was being given something he hadn't considered, an opportunity to change. Chief Carter's father gave him a long, quiet look before turning to his son. "We should go," he said, his voice even, as if the moment had already passed. Carter nodded and took one last look at Daniels. "You'll hear from me soon." With that, they walked away, leaving Daniels standing alone. The room around him was still full of officers, still buzzing with conversation, but everything felt different now. He felt different. As he made his way toward the exit, he caught sight of Holloway watching him from across the room. The older officer gave him a small nod. Whether it was approval or warning, Daniels wasn't sure. He had made his choice, and now he had to live with it. Outside, the air was cool against his skin. He took a deep breath, trying to shake the tension still sitting in his chest. His mind replayed everything, the mistake he had made, the shame that followed, the unexpected chance to make it right. For the first time in a long while, he saw things differently. He had been so sure of his own authority, so quick to judge, never thinking about the people on the other side. He had let his uniform define him in the wrong way, had used it as a shield instead of a responsibility. And now he had to face that truth. But maybe that was the point. Maybe Chief Carter wasn't just giving him a second chance. He was giving him a choice. To stay the same or to be better. Daniels didn't know what the future held, but as he walked away from the precinct, he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't the end of his story. It was just the beginning of a new one.